Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this press conference on dangerous distractions. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate the early start. As we've seen at COP29 and throughout the year, rich countries are failing to step up on their climate obligations to tackle the root causes of the climate crisis, and that is the extraction and use of fossil fuels. Particularly at COP29, we're also seeing their lack of willingness to pay up for the climate finance that they are also obliged to pay. Instead, they're heavily investing in speculative techno-fixes and false solutions that actually end up prolonging the lifetime of fossil fuels and can be used to justify the production of new fossil fuels. This is nothing but greenwash. It is allowing polluters to continue polluting. We've seen things like yesterday here at the talks, the hydrogen declaration being released, which is kind of promoting new fossil fuels through the production of fossil fuel-based hydrogen with carbon capture and storage. To dive into carbon capture and storage a little bit to begin with, it's a proven to fail technology that doesn't reduce emissions and can actually prolong the use of fossil fuels. It claims that you can manage your emissions rather than actually having to cut them. It's been around for decades, and that has been decades of over-promising and under-delivering. But CCS is on the rise, despite the fact that it is so ineffective. And it's useful to ask why that might be. The Centre for International Environmental Law can reveal this morning new analysis that counts the number of lobbyists at COP29 that are associated with companies that promote this ineffective technology of carbon capture and storage. At COP29, there are 480 of these lobbyists this year promoting CCS. This is a really significant number. It's actually an increase on last year, which you may remember, COP28 was a much larger event. This year is much smaller, and yet the number of lobbyists has increased on CCS. Looking at that number, 480 CCS lobbyists, that's greater than the combined delegations of the EU, the US, the UK, and Canada altogether. This number, this high number, this significant number is really indicative of the effort and investment that the fossil fuel industry is putting into securing its own future, securing business as usual, despite the urgent climate action that we need. We can see this reflected in things like the over-reliance or the reliance on CCS in national climate plans and NDCs, which is increasing, in the amount of money, a colossal amount of money that is going into CCS projects and investments. And on day one, when we saw the carbon markets approval here at COP29, that really opened or propped open the window for more technologies and for carbon removals that are underpinned by CCS. Ultimately, every penny invested in CCS is invested in the fossil fuel industry. I'm delighted to be joined by panellists where we can dive into more of these false solutions and dangerous distractions. I'll introduce them and then we will kind of move to each one in turn. We have Dr. Tamara Gilbertson, the coordinator of the Climate Change Programme at the Indigenous Environment Network, a scholar, activist, and an author of numerous publications. We've got Erica Ojuguna, she's a Nairobi-based trans climate justice organiser. She's the global coordinator of the Alliance of Non-Governmental Radical Youth, or ANGRY, and she works with youth-led groups to fight for a fossil-free and debt-free global south. Finally, we've got Al Johnson-Kurtz, the industry communications campaigner at Oil Change International, where they execute traditional and digital media strategies to disrupt big oil and gas narratives and counter industry disinformation. And I believe we'll pass to Al first.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning. My name is Al Johnson-Kurtz. I'm from the United States, and I work for Oil Change International. I'm here to present our data about how governments around the world are handing out our tax money to dangerous, failing technology that will exacerbate the climate crisis. However, I want to begin by sharing a personal story. Last summer, my town was under around 1 meter of water from extreme flooding. There was muddy trash up to about a story high outside most downtown businesses for weeks, including cinema seats, restaurant equipment, books, and the belongings of our loved ones and community members. It's painful to think back on it, but I'm grateful and proud of how many community members banded together to muck out basements, repair the blown out roads and bridges, and support people who were displaced. All this in a state in the United States, Vermont, that was previously touted as a haven from climate change. And let me be clear, there are no climate havens. We saw that in my hometown last summer. To avoid more climate disasters like what happened in Montpelier, we need a full, fast, fair, and funded fossil fuel phase-out. Anything less is driving us all closer to catastrophe. This year, the annual United Nations climate change negotiations are about money. Rich countries bear the biggest responsibility for causing the climate crisis because of their high levels of pollution and many, many years of historical pollution. They need to pay up. Instead, they're pumping billions into carbon capture to avoid doing their duty and taking real climate action. This benefits the very companies responsible for climate disasters like the one that happened to my community in Montpelier. These are the same companies pushing for techno fixes, and they're pocketing our tax dollars in the process. After 50 years of development and billions in investment, the evidence is clear. Carbon capture projects have overpromised and underdelivered while continuing to receive handouts via our tax money around the world. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change lists carbon capture as one of the most expensive and least effective emissions mitigation options available. Carbon capture has a history of underperforming and over-reporting. Even if carbon capture functioned as planned, the projects currently operating globally would only capture under 0.1% of yearly emissions. Carbon capture also means more fossil fuels, and I'm going to explain that. Carbon capture is promoted by fossil fuel companies and their enablers and governments around the world to prolong the use of fossil fuels. It's a solution for the fossil fuel industry, not for our communities or the clean air, land, and water that we rely on. The reality is that carbon capture means more fossil fuels because 60% of carbon captured today comes from fossil gas processing plants, not from the air. 79% of the world's CCS operating capacity actually sends the carbon to produce more oil via enhanced oil recovery. That's where they pump the carbon under the ground to bring out more oil from old wells. I also want to speak to the public money that is being pushed into this. Oil Change International has compiled a unique database that tracks government awards towards carbon capture and fossil-based hydrogen research, towards fossil-based hydrogen projects from 1984 to 2024. This is for the projects on carbon capture and fossil-based hydrogen research, development, and pilot commercial projects. Our database shows that $30 billion of public money has already been wasted in the last 40 years on failing carbon capture and fossil hydrogen projects, with hundreds of billions more planned, all while rich nations refuse to deliver the trillions needed for real solutions to the climate crisis. It's no coincidence that the government's spending and planning to spend the most on carbon capture technologies, that's the United States, Canada, the European Union, Norway, the United Kingdom, are the same governments responsible for large shares of emissions via their extensive fossil fuel sectors. These governments have a historical responsibility to combat the climate crisis, yet they are more interested in looking like they're acting on climate change than actually acting. They delay climate action while poisoning us, our land, and our water. Instead of wasting our precious time and money on carbon capture, governments must commit to justly and urgently phasing out fossil fuels and pay up for the real solutions our communities desperately need.
Fantastic, thank you, Al. I'm now delighted to be able to pass to Tamara.
Good morning, and thank you everybody for being here today to speak a little bit about the false solutions we're seeing here at COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. As many of you know, on the very first day of the COP presidency pushed through a couple of documents that were supposed to go through a party-driven process. Those documents, one of them includes the carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas removals document that's situated underneath Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is where the carbon markets are situated. Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement are the carbon offsets, and that's where this removals document was pushed through without a party-driven process. And it really speaks to the desperation of the UNFCCC at this point to desperately need some kind of a win on the first day, because it's increasingly losing the battle against the action on climate change. So once these rules are in place, what are the incentives then? What incentives then do they have to improve them? So what we're also seeing in Article 6 and the carbon markets there is this increasing discourse on how Article 6 carbon markets can be used as climate finance, or to pull out percentages of the profit from carbon markets to then use as climate finance for the global south. But relying on unstable carbon markets, will never produce any type of adequate funding that will address adaptation or mitigation. And in fact, it will put countries at risk and of course let northern governments or developed countries off the hook completely for their historical emissions. But I want to talk a little bit about what's actually in the removals document and why that's important. Under the Kyoto Protocol, we had something called the Clean Development Mechanism, which is actually still running, but the CDM was for offset programs only in the Global South to sell credits to the Global North. Article 6.4, what's called the Mechanism Database, and it has a few different names, will expand that greatly, and it will include methodology around what's called carbon dioxide or greenhouse gas removal. So what are removals? Removals are two different things. One are biological removals, which are forest offsets, soil offsets, and moving into oceans and water offsets. And on the other side, we have geoengineering technologies or technological removals that also include carbon capture and storage, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and also we're seeing hydrogen build out with carbon capture and storage. So this is massively problematic. As my colleagues have pointed out, CCS is expanding globally as a result of the fossil fuel industries aiming to mask their greenhouse gas emissions by using an old technology, which is called enhanced oil recovery. EOR has been around for over 40 years. As my colleagues have pointed out, billions of dollars have been pushed into EOR technologies with very little result. It's estimated that something between 2 to 7% of the CO2 that's captured is actually captured and stored. But what's more important is it's not just about next to the refineries where the capture isn't happening or it's an old technology. They use this to push, they compress the CO2 to make it a liquid state, push it underground for the purposes of pulling out more oil and gas. And those numbers are not calculated. That oil and gas that's pulled out is not part of the equation. So what we're seeing, at least I can speak for the United States and Turtle Island, is what we're seeing is the CCS is being pushed on indigenous peoples and targeted in indigenous peoples' territories. And it's not just about the site of the emissions, but also the pipelines. And we know in the US that indigenous peoples have stood up and will stand against the expansion of pipelines across their lands everywhere. And this is why, especially in the upper Midwest, that these massive CCS pipelines have not succeeded in being built yet, because there is resistance happening. We also know that this is impacting Black communities in the Gulf South states, and that there is resistance everywhere, and that resistance will continue. Further, I want to point out that one of the reasons that this is happening is because of the expansion of the 45Q tax break in the US. And that 45Q tax break has enabled money to come out of the US government, the federal government, through the DOE to continue an expansion of CCS. And what we're very concerned about here is, what does that mean when Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, which will be used by countries for their NDCs to be linked into the offsets, can they then use CCS as an ITMO and an offset? And if that's the case, is there sort of a double, profit building here? Where they get a 45Q tax break, plus it's being used as an NDC for an ITMO, and it could be used additionally as a carbon offset, because CCS is already in some of the voluntary offset markets. So this is like a triple profit. There's no oversight on this. We're also seeing build-outs of hydrogen with CCS, whereby in the United States, at least, they're targeting indigenous peoples and tribes to build out the hydrogen, saying it's clean, it's blue hydrogen, it's a clean hydrogen, it's gray hydrogen, it's don't worry about it. And the message I want to say here is that we say no to carbon markets, we say no to the expansion of the fossil fuel industries, we say no to greenwash, we say no to targeting indigenous peoples, and what we need here is a clean, just phase out of fossil fuels at source, and to keep it in the ground now. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, thank you so much, Tamara. I will hand over to Erica.
Hi, I'm Erica Njuguna, Youth Climate Justice Organizer based in Nairobi, Kenya. And I'll be talking about false solutions and their human rights impacts in the Global South. Well, we're all familiar with words like abated, unabated, net zero, and behind these words lies dangerous, unproven destructions that seeks to extend the lifeline of the fossil fuel industry. But not only that, they are harming communities on the ground, and they're literally a get-out-of-jail card for the fossil fuel industry. They're the last straws of a dying industry. Research by the Kick Big Polluters Out coalition highlighted that there are 1,773 fossil fuel lobbyists at this COP. Their presence has served to derail climate action, only to protect the interests of shareholders at the expense of communities and the planet. Some of the dangerous distractions that these lobbyists have been pushing include CCS and carbon markets. Our governments are literally in bed with the fossil fuel industry and their cronies. These false solutions receive huge amounts of public funding when real solutions remain underfunded. We are also seeing a massive build-out of petrochemical industries that also seek to extend the lifeline of the fossil fuel industry. In Kenya, corporations from the global north have flooded our forests and biodiversity to offset their emissions in flawed projects that are linked to serious human rights abuses, including sexual abuse. On the other side, dangerous solutions like geoengineering, the intentional manipulation of the earth systems to lower global heating, which I personally consider to be a taboo, are being considered. These have dangerous impacts on the earth and should not even be on the table being considered. We need a global moratorium against geoengineering. To have a chance at limiting a global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees, we need real zero. We must phase out, not phase down, abated or unabated fossil fuels. We must phase out all fossil fuels. The IEA is clear that there is no room for new oil and gas if we want to limit a global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. To be able to achieve this, we need public money going to real solutions not dangerous distractions. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody. We've spoken a lot about all of the false solutions that are cropping up. We've spoken about, geoengineering, carbon capture and storage, the hydrogen build-out that we're seeing across Europe and across the world, the huge investments that are going into propping these technologies up and actually creating markets for them, because most of them don't have markets or a business case as is. We've spoken about the petrochemical build-out, which I think is a really important point. This isn't just about burning fossil fuels, it's about all the other escape hatches for the fossil fuel industry in petrochemicals and agrochemicals as well. But we can talk about what we want to see as well. So I'd love to come to maybe each of the panelists for 2 minutes about what we think the real solutions are, and how we can build a better world without these dangerous distractions. Would anybody like to volunteer to go first? Al, thank you.
Well, I'll go back to the story that I was sharing from my community at the beginning, and we're going to be seeing these destructive impacts of the fossil fuel industry all over the world more and more, right? What we need is the trillions that the global north and rich polluting countries owe to be delivered so that people who are suffering from the impacts of climate change around the world have what they need to build back and build the real solutions, renewables and community infrastructure to be able to live good lives and have clean air, water, and land.
Fantastic, thank you. Tamara?
So 80% of the biodiversity in the world is in indigenous peoples' territories. And the rights of indigenous peoples must be upheld if we have any chance of survival. So we need to start with understanding that we don't come to the COP to ask for their solutions, because the only thing they have here is looking at finance and debt creating mechanisms and debt creation for the global south. They talk about money, they talk about finance, and they talk about ways to make more money, profit, and finance. And that's the end of the conversation. We don't come here to look for solutions from the UNFCCC. We have those solutions already. There are communities all over the world, from small farming communities to indigenous just transition, to many projects and people that are doing this work every single day. And it is work. Keeping a forest alive and thriving is work. Keeping communities alive and thriving is work. Working with just transition on the ground is work, and that is happening, but it's not happening here. We come here to know our enemies. This is about a continuation of a colonial program and project. So I would say, we go home to share this information with the people that we work with so that we can be stronger in our struggles. And I would say, one other thing is that when Biden leaves office, he doesn't really have a lot to lose. And, we'd really like to see FPIC implemented as an executive order, for example. Free, prior, and informed consent is extremely important to Indigenous peoples. And again, communities have the answers. We don't need a top-down strategy, and I think that we're stronger together. Global solidarity is something that we do here, and I look forward to doing more of that work together as we move towards a day of action. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you. Erica?
Okay, so the existence of all of these false solutions are to serve the interests of the fossil fuel industries, just to extend the lifeline of the fossil fuel industry when we know they're already failing. So a real solution that saves us from the damage that these false solutions cause is to really cut emissions, phase out all fossil fuels. And we need to do this in a just and equitable manner that prioritizes workers, and it has to be fully, fairly funded. We need climate finance that is non-debt creating to the scale of trillions. To be able to support this phase out, we need a mass exodus away from investor-state dispute mechanisms that only serve to benefit the interests of corporates. We need to leave the Energy Charter Treaty, for instance. And whilst we build out renewable energy, we also need to do this in a just and equitable way that doesn't replicate the same extractive capitalist system that has kept us still in the fossil fuel era. We are seeing the rush for critical minerals fueling war crimes in Congo and other parts of the world. We need to make sure that the just transition prioritizes communities, prioritizes the global south, and meets the energy demand of global south countries.
Fantastic, thank you. Before we wrap up, in a minute, I will take moderator's prerogative and also, talk about maybe one of the solutions that we can see here. As I mentioned, there are 480 CCS lobbyists this year at COP29, which is an increase on last year. We really need to reform the climate negotiations process to reduce that influence, conflict of interest, to make sure that the voices of people on the front lines, not the voice of polluters, are taking centre stage here and in other fora where these big decisions about the future are made. And on that note, I shall wrap up. Thank you very much to our panellists. I appreciate it, and yeah, thank you all. If anybody does have any questions, we will be outside. Yeah.